In this video, we're going to be talking about the primary message that Jesus spread throughout his life and ministry. And then we're also going to talk about how the Jews would have understood the message that Jesus was teaching and preaching. So first, Jesus's primary message throughout his life was that he was the Messiah. He was the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. And so for us now, it's important to know the meaning of the word Messiah and also what the Jews were thinking of when they heard this term. So first, Messiah is a Hebrew word, and the Greek equivalent is Christ or Christos. And you see that all throughout the New Testament. Basically what those mean is anointed one. So the word Messiah doesn't officially occur in the Old Testament, but the term of anointed one does occur roughly 40 times. And in the Old Testament, it's often referring to kings or prophets. And so there's this pretty broad sense to the word. It was definitely, for the Jews, it definitely would have been a familiar word that had specific connotations when they heard this word. But what it actually meant, or what their specific expectations were of this Messiah figure, that tended to vary. There wasn't just this one unified picture of what this Messiah would look like. So every Jew was aware that God had promised to send a Messiah, or the Messiah, the anointed one. From the time of the Old Testament, you have all these Old Testament prophecies that look forward to this Messiah that Yahweh, or God, has promised to his people. We talked a little bit about that in the one of the other lecture videos, that God had promised things to the Israelites, given that they were his chosen people. And one of those promises was the Messiah that these people had been looking forward to and having this hope in. So really this hope, as we talked about, is just, it was such a major part of their faith. And so now we're going to look at what exactly they had in mind for this Messiah based on what it says in the Old Testament. So basically there are four big categories that people were thinking of when they thought of what this Messiah would be like. So four big expectations. The first one is that the Messiah would be the King of the Jews. Okay, so the true king would be anointed by Yahweh. If you think back to the Old Testament, remember King David. This was the first king that had been anointed by Yahweh. And so all the kings after that were compared to King David. He was the man after God's own heart. And so the people were hoping for another king like David. They were wanting this Messiah to come in and rule the people as David did. If you are interested in where kind of these kingly expectations are in the Old Testament, check out Jeremiah 33, Isaiah 9, and Zechariah 9. Okay, so just as King David was an ethnic Jew, this was also part of this being the true king. He was an ethnic Jew. This is who the Messiah should be. So remember kind of the context of the New Testament world at this time. The Jews are being ruled by Roman officials, so they're not ruling themselves, they're not independent, but rather they are oppressed by having another world power rule over them. And so the Messiah would be someone that brings about the renewal of the nation of Israel and unites them as a nation. The second one is that the Messiah would win a decisive battle over the pagans. Once again, back to this, the context of this time. At this time, the world power that was ruling over them was Rome. But if you remember from the Old Testament or the intertestamental period video, Rome was not the first world power to rule over them. So the Messiah would be one who comes and he is the underdog. He comes in and he defeats this world power, these world powers, so that he can rule the nation of Israel in independence, that they can govern themselves. So think of this Messiah, that he would bring about, he would take back God's people, and they would be, in all senses of the word, officially out of exile. Okay, so he was going to come in as the underdog and make things right. The third one is that the Messiah would rebuild or cleanse the temple. So we've talked a little bit about how important the temple was to Judaism. The temple was very central to the life of the Jews. It's actually been described as the jewel of the city. So there was the temple, and it was in Jerusalem, and it was the very center of the city. It's what the whole city was built around. And so it wasn't just like in a geographical sense, or even just in a religious sense. It was economic, it was political. So the temple was very much the complete center of the lives of the Jews. Also, it was, as being a religious place, it was where Yahweh resided. And so you can see how important it is for the Jews for the temple to be cleansed, and for them to be able to worship Yahweh as they know they are supposed to. So the Messiah will be one who comes in and cleanses the temple. At this time, it was corrupt. It was, not a place where pure worship was held. And so part of what the Messiah would do is he would come in and take control of the temple and make things right. And then finally, the Messiah would bring God-given justice and peace to the world. So looking back at previous videos, we talked about how the Jews were not, it was a rough time for them at the beginning, kind of in the world at the beginning of the New Testament for the Jews. So there was political unrest. There was, them being ruled by someone else. And so it was really a dark time for them with no rest. And so the Jews were just expectantly waiting, hopefully waiting with this anticipation that God would send this Messiah, this true King, to help them, to bring about justice and peace. So you can see that there's so much riding on the line for them, that they are looking for this figure to come and to just turn everything upside down, to make all the wrongs right. So then Jesus, as I said before, Jesus claims that he was the Messiah. But interestingly, he wasn't the first to claim that he was the Messiah. There were at least 3 pretty prominent figures before the birth of Jesus that claimed to take on this role, to be this figure, or their followers attributed this role to them. And then after Jesus's death and resurrection, there were even more people that claimed to be the Messiah. And so for the Jews, it was very important for them to look at the Old Testament, look at the scripture they know, and then compare that to Jesus's life, to Jesus of Nazareth, and see, does he fit the mold of what the Old Testament has been telling us this Messiah would look like? So for them, as I've kind of shown, this is their whole life. For the Jews, really, religion was not just something, on the outskirt of their life. This was the center of their life. It's what, they based everything in their life around. And so looking for this Messiah figure, there was a lot of weight to figuring out who this Messiah was, and checking to see if these people that claimed to be the Messiah truly were, and how much they matched up. So they had to see and decide for themselves, is this Jesus, is he the Messiah that he claims to be? And so I hope that as we're reading and as we're studying the person of Jesus and his ministry, that we can see for ourselves how he does fulfill the Old Testament prophecies and how he lives up to his claim that he is the Messiah. So just be keeping these in mind as you, specifically as you study through the Gospels, but also as you make your way really through all of the New Testament.